Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first PGABC Virtual Series Education Session of 2026. As many of you now know, the PGABC is proud to announce that it will not only be continuing to provide a monthly virtual education event in these shoulder season or off-season months, but we'll also be making these sessions free for PGA of Canada members going forward. On that note, I do believe we have some guests from other part of the country here already, so welcome. Shortly, PGABC members, you'll be able to click on the link in the chat to get your PDP points. And I'll also point out that members will be able to access recorded versions of most of these presentations, this one being included. So if you aren't able to attend all the virtual sessions live, you will still have an opportunity to watch much of the content thereafter. PGABC is committed to providing quality information to its members across a variety of topics. One topic that can be so impactful to the perceptions and misconceptions around golf, perhaps even more so than other sports, is data analysis. So today we are thrilled to be joined by Lou Stagner, whom at least a few of you know personally, and many of you will know via his online presences. Lou's an assistant coach with the Princeton University varsity golf team, also an advisor with Arccos Golf, among a number of other titles and labels I'll forget. So no stretch at all to call him an industry leader in this space. As I am about to turn over the control to Lou, I'm going to remind everyone to please feel free to ask questions as we go by using the chat dialogue. We've had some sent in already from members. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to do my best to monitor the chat. We'll probably interrupt Lou once or twice here to ask some questions as we go along, and then save some time for Q&A at the end of the session. Of course, you can click in the top right of your screen, adjust the view to side-by-side speaker is our recommended way of viewing this presentation. That's all I've got here. Mr. Stagner, thank you very much again for your time here, for coming and presenting to all of our PGA members. Please take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate you having me here, and I'll apologize in advance. It's been quite the day here for me. I was telling the guys here, my daughter woke up with a 40.1 Celsius fever, a really horrible case of the flu. It's been a brutal vomit-filled day. And my head's still kind of spinning, but love presenting to a room full of golf pros. There's still not enough here to fix my train wreck of a swing, but if I try to get some questions about my game as we go here, don't be surprised. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get this underway. See everything okay? Just give me the thumbs up if you can see it.
Got it there. Supercharge your coaching with data.
Yeah, awesome. All right, let's get into this. If you do have questions as we go along here, please feel free to ask. What's interesting is it's not letting me advance in your share. I can't go to my next slide. I don't know why. Dead. Won't let me go. You can see my first screen. I can't hear you, Mark.
Yeah, sorry, that's not something we've run across here before.
Let me stop and let me try sharing the entire screen and see if that works. Yeah. I'm going to have to make that smaller because that's just going to get in the way and not be fun. There we go. All right. Now we're cooking. All right, excellent. Cool. All right, that works. I'll just have to be mindful that you'll be able to see anything I pull up off to the side. So as Mark mentioned, a couple of things. I'm data insights lead at Arccos, assistant coach for the Princeton men's golf team, co-host the Hack It Out Golf podcast with Mark Crossfield and Greg Chalmers, and ambassador at Titleist Golf Tech Strakaline. And I also have a day job. I am the vice president of AI and analytics for a very large company based in the Northeast, and want to give a special shout out to Arccos. All of this data is from their massive data set. I think we're up to like 1.5 billion shots. And put that in perspective, ShotLink, which is what they use on the PGA Tour, they've been using that since the early 2000s, and there's only about 30 million shots in all of ShotLink for all those years, and we're at 1.5 billion. So there's really not much that I can't look at. I can get so granular with investigating what's going on out there on the golf course, and because our sample size are massive, I can look at lots of really interesting things. All right, next, let's go to the agenda. I'm going to go through this quickly. Each one of these things could be almost a full day session, but I'm going to hit on a couple of these. And really, if you have some questions as we're going along here, Please feel free to interject, either put it in the chat, or if you have the ability to turn your mic on, please feel to jump in and ask, and I'm happy to answer those as we go, or just save them up and give you plenty of time at the end. And I'm willing to stick around as long as you like. If you have questions when I'm done, I'll stick around for a few hours if you need me to. I've presented at a bunch of different events like this, and I always get feedback that more time for Q&A. So I'm going to leave you plenty of time here for any questions that you might have. So let's get into the first one: why you should track your stats. So why should you track your stats? I'm going to talk about why they're important, but we're going to look at some skill differences between handicaps here. I'm going to pull some things up. And so let's start off with looking at a 10 index versus a 5 index. The skill difference between a 10 and a 5 is 5 shots. But where does that difference come from? Where does the 5 shots come from? Is it from their driver, their irons, their short game, their putting? Let's take a look at some of those numbers. So let's look at the second line down. There's a bunch of numbers here. Just look at the second line down for a second. To go from a 10 index to a 5 index, 38% of that is going to come from approach play, 29% from off the tee, which is mostly your driver, 12% or 13% around the green, and 20% for putting. And this is the typical 10 index versus the typical 5 index. And that word typical is really important because not everybody is typical. We're all different. We all have our own unique blueprint. We all have our own unique fingerprint on how we play the game. And we're gonna look at that, and you're gonna see some, what exactly that means from a numbers perspective here on the next slide. So each one of these shows what you need to do to make the jump to the next level. And you can see, going from a 20 to a 15, 15 to a 10, et cetera, they're relatively close. They're really similar across every skill jump. So what that means at a very high level, like knowing nothing else about a high index player or mid index player, they got to get better at ball striking. So they got to be, approach play would be kind of where you would start. Off the tee would be next. And then around the green and putting kind of bring up the rear. But that, again, that's for the typical player. And we are not all typical. So not everybody is typical. We all are very different. We all have different skills and excel in different parts of the game. I assume that every single one of you, if you're on the lesson tee and still giving lessons, you've heard from so many students that show up. You ask them, tell me about your game. What are you trying to get out of lessons? And they all say, I want to be more consistent. One of the benefits about tracking your stats is they can show up with some numbers, and you can have a much better idea of the strengths and the weaknesses of their game and where they should or could be focusing their time and where you can work with them on that. It's much better than the typical, I just want to be more consistent. That doesn't, generally give you a whole lot to go on. So we're going to look at the difference between at a given skill level. We're going to look at the difference between the best players and the worst players at that skill level, so at that handicap level in each of the categories. So there's a bunch of numbers that are going to show up here. Don't try to take all these in at one. Let's just start on the 10 index line, and let's start for putting. And I'll explain what that means, and then you'll be able to easily interpret the rest of these things. So what this is saying, if I got all of the 10 index players, and I got the best 10 index putters, the top 5% putters, remember, there's still a 10 index, top 5% putters, and I got the bottom 5% putters of all the 10 index players. And I looked at their skill difference in putting, it's about 6 shots per round. So the best 10 index putter, again, remember, they're both 10 indexes. The best one putts kind of like a scratch. The worst one putts kind of like a 22 handicap, if you want to think of it that way. So, knowing nothing else about a 10 index, I'm probably going to work on ball striking. But if you have that 10 index come across your lesson tee that's in the bottom 10% of putters for 10 index, there's a significant amount of low-hanging fruit. So another way to think of this with this example is if you have someone show up on your lesson tee and they're a 10 index, and they are amongst the worst putting 10 indexes out there. If you could snap your fingers overnight and turn them into one of the best putting 10 index players out there, they would instantly gain 6 shots and they'd become a 4. So knowing nothing else, yes, work on ball striking, but this is a great example of why you want to know how they're performing in across every part of the game. And you can see, these numbers vary based on skill level. The 20 indexes are obviously going to have a little bit bigger of a gap than the scratch players. And you can see they're relatively similar, like similar shapes, similar forms, similar concepts here on where the strokes are and how much difference there is. But there is a wide variance. Not every 10 index player is the same. Not every scratch player is the same. We all have different unique things that we are good at and that we're bad at. And we're going to talk a lot about this concept and some of the corresponding numbers and things as we go through today's presentation. And again, I want to give you like a big caveat for all the things we're going to talk about today. Every situation on the golf course is different, and a lot of the things that we're going to go through today, they're good starting points on how to think about a situation. A lot of everything that I'm going to talk about today is rooted in numbers. It's rooted in the math. And one of the things that is interesting to me is that the moment a player is not comfortable with the math is wrong. It doesn't matter. You can throw it out the window. So I can give, if I'm walking with a Princeton player, and I can give them an optimal target, I can give them, some type of mathematically, quote unquote, optimal decision. And if they just don't like that kind of shot, if they get the heebie-jeebies, if there's, trouble all the way down the left and there's wind off the right, and it's just a bad combination for them, that target or that club that we're picking is no longer the right situation. So it's important to adjust based on the situation. It's not always black and white. There's a whole lot of gray area, and what we're trying to do is start from a baseline and then navigate that gray area as best as we can. I think of trying to use math, numbers to drive strategy, analytics, decisions, choices. I think of it like blackjack, where if you were to play blackjack for the first time and you've never really played before, you're going to get one of those little cards with the basic rules on what to do when. And you get those cards and you try to follow those rules because they're going to optimize your chances of winning the most money possible. And you try to stack things in your favor. But if you want to ramp that up, you're going to start counting cards. They don't really allow that. You're going to get in trouble for it, and you're going to get your finger busted. But if you can count cards, what you're doing is there's standard strategy. But what you can do is you can change your bet size as the count becomes in your favor, or you can put one chip out there when the count isn't in your favor. And that's how I think about strategy and using math to make decisions. When I know what the basic card and rules tell me, but if it isn't in my favor, I'm going to get way more conservative. And if it's really in my favor, if I'm having one of those days where I'm flighting it how I want, I'm hitting every window, and I'm extremely confident over that shot, I'm going to get more aggressive. And that's the part that we try to navigate through as well as we possibly can. So next thing we're going to talk about here, first target, or second topic, is half wedge versus full wedge. It's always a really interesting topic. It always gets a ton of feedback. It's one of the things I put out there that I've talked about on many occasions that always drives a ton of response from players, So is it better to have a full wedge from 100 yards or an awkward half wedge from 50 yards? And there's a lot of players that think the full wedge is the better play. And I looked at this in detail in the Arccos data set, and I compared players to themselves. So I found a huge sample size of players that within a given year, within a given calendar year, a given season, they had at least 30 shots from like that 50-yard mark in the fairway, and they had 30 or more shots from that 100-yard mark in the fairway, plus or minus a few yards. And then I also threw in there, and you'll see why, they had to have at least 30 shots from around that 50-yard mark in the rough. And you'll see how that comes into this in just a second. So what did the study results look like? What did I learn from this? And I'm going to go through these one at a time. Of the players that were in here, and there were thousands upon thousands of players that fell into this sample, 96% were better with a half wedge. So they had better scoring from closer. They had closer proximity. They hit more greens, and we're going to get in that in a second. They were just significantly better from 50 yards than they are from 100 yards. Closer, in most cases, is typically better. And one of the things I want to put out there right away is, if you follow me on social media, you've probably seen me put out there a million times, advance the ball as far as you can, as far as you safely can, making sure that you're taking into account, penalty strokes and other hazards and other problems. And this is the reason why. The closer you get, the lower your score to hole out from there becomes. We want to advance it as close as we possibly can. Next thing, 60% better scoring average with half wedge by a quarter shot or more. So if I looked at the average number of shots to get the ball in the hole from 100 yards versus 50 yards, 60% of players were more than a quarter shot better in that scoring average from 50 yards than they were from 100 yards. That's a lot. That's pretty significant. A quarter shot between those things is a pretty huge delta. Only 0.1% were better with a full wedge by a quarter shot or more. Only 0.1%. So 60% were way better with the half wedge, and only 0.1% were way better with the full wedge. Those are two remarkably different numbers across this sample. 95% hit the green more often with the half wedge than they did the full wedge. Again, significant differences here. 97% had a closer average proximity with the half wedge, so they're hitting it a lot closer, which is what you need to do. If you're scoring that much better, you're hitting it that much closer. Closer you start to the hole, the lower your number of shots to get the ball in the hole is typically going to be. And 85% had a better up and down percent with half wedge, so more people were getting it on the green and in the hole from 50 yards than they were from 100 yards, which again just makes sense. That's what it's gonna be like across a large enough number of shots. So there's a couple of other things that I'll go through here. 85% had a better average score with half wedge to front pins. It's one of the things people always push back on is, well, what about a front pin? When I don't have any room to work with, I can't really spin the ball from 50 yards. I have to lay back in that situation. Well, when you're at 100 yards, your dispersion is so much bigger than it is from 50 yards. Your dispersion tends to get tighter the closer you get to the hole. And you're just going to score better. You're going to be able to place the ball in better situations. I do completely recognize that there are some situations, because golf isn't consistent, it's not the same every time, where you run into some front pins that are really challenging for whatever reason. And in those situations, I still want you to get the ball as close as possible, because your dispersion is going to get tighter. You're going to miss, especially for us weekend warriors like me, we're missing a lot of greens from 100 yards. We're going to miss less from 50, typically. And when our dispersion is a little bit tighter, one of the key takeaways, as you get closer to the hole, angles start to matter a little bit more. And there will be situations where you do have a 50-yard shot and you have a little bit more green to work with, because maybe you're on the edge of the fairway one way or the other, and it's just a little bit easier way to approach. And in those situations, you can be a little bit more aggressive with a 50-yard shot. But one of the things, and I think this is one of the biggest issues, is that there's a lot of players, when they get to that 50-yard range and closer, they're always just going at the hole, always. And that's not always what you should do. There are plenty of situations, even though you might be 40, 50 yards away from the hole, where you want to pick a spot away from the hole. You want to play away from the hole a little bit. And the reason that is better than being back at 100 yards is, remember, your dispersion is a lot tighter. So I can pick a little bit more conservative, a little bit safer target from 50 yards. It might be beyond the hole to a front pin, or maybe off to the side and beyond the hole to a front pin. And I'm going to hit it into a tighter area around my target. I'm going to hit more greens, and I'm going to hit way more greens than I would from 100 yards because my dispersion gets bigger. Next
Lou,
number.
sorry to interrupt. One question right on this, if I could. Previous table, you had it broken down by skill level or separated by skill level. This half versus full wedge phenomenon, relatively the same across skill levels?
Same across all, yeah, great question.
Right.
Same across all skill levels. Yeah, it looks this way across all skill levels. And I'm going to tell you the folks that, and you've seen these people across your lesson tee, I'll tell you the folks that are struggling. One more number to go through, two more. 84% had a higher hit green percentage with a half wedge to front pins, and 85% had a closer proximity with a half wedge than a full wedge to front pins. The players, and this was probably the really interesting part, it was obvious to me when I wanted to look at the players that were doing better from full wedge distance than they were from half wedge distance. And I stumbled into it just by accident. Those players, when I looked at how they performed around the green, closer in tight, it was obvious to me that they were dealing with the yips. It was, I could see there were so many occasions where those players were, you had a 15-yard shot and they hit it 3 yards, or they had a 15-yard shot and they hit it 50 yards because they bladed it over, or they, hit one off the hosel and you could see that they just stone cold shanked it. So the players that were better with the full wedge in these situations, they clearly looked like they were having a bit of the yips, and for whatever reason, and they were just struggling as they got closer, which is, for them certainly is better to be, back in the full wedge range. But, for them, the full wedge was easier because, if you're hitting it off the hosel a lot, it's a tough place to score from. So they were just struggling with the yips. And the other thing too, that I think why people really struggle with this concept is proximity and scoring is not linear. And what I mean by that is the closer you get to the green, the more things start to flatten out. So here's an example. For a 10 index, if you're asked a 10 index, do you want to hit this approach shot from 200 yards or from 150 yards? They're all going to say 150 because we know that 150 is a lot easier than 200, especially for a 10 index. The difference in average shots to get down for a 10 index between 200 yards and 150 yards is 0.4 shots roughly. So 4/10 of a stroke is the difference. If I were to take that same 10 index and put them 100 yards in the fairway versus 50 yards in the fairway, the difference in scoring is 0.23 shots. So it's almost, not quite half, but almost half of what it is from 200 to 150. So one of the reasons people, kind of default to this, I want to have this full wedge, is because as we start to get closer, there's not as big of a benefit compared to that 200 to 150 example. Like it's a 4/10 of a stroke difference between 200 and 150, where 100 to 50 is only quote unquote, only 0.23 shots, which is still massive. Like anytime you can make a decision where you're picking up a quarter shot, like that's a huge decision to make. But to us, it doesn't feel as beneficial as it does when you look at that 200 to 150 example. So I think that's one of the concepts that gets in the way of a lot of golfers and how they think about this, is because the benefit of being closer as we get closer starts to shrink a little bit. And that's why they don't feel that same improvement that they do 200 to 150 as this 100 to 50 yard example. All right, next, we're going to talk about stock shots. I did a 7-iron study a couple of years ago. I think there's at least one or two that were part of this study that are on this call today. And I had over 200 players that ended up participating, and it was a multiple day study, and I had them hit 50 stock shots, 50 shots that were a half club less, and 50 shots that were a half club more. So, if they typically hit their 7-iron 150, and their 8-iron 140, and their 6-iron 160, I was having them hit the stock 150 shot. Then I would try to have them hit a 145 shot. Then I would have them try to hit a 155 shot. And I was really curious to see what that did to a couple of things with their dispersion. And I was surprised at the outcomes, at least a couple of the outcomes. So a few ellipses on here. The black one is stock shots. It shows what their dispersion looked like, and it's the smallest. Hard shots, that's the 150-yard shot that you tried to hit 155, so like a half club more, you really went after it. And the soft shots are the dotted area there, and that's where you tried to swing a half club less. One of the things I thought that when they went a little bit softer, I thought that would be the tightest dispersion, but it wasn't. Just normal stock shots are the tightest dispersion. The one thing that stood out to me here that was interesting was the hard shots. You can see that it's much flatter. So the north-south dispersion is tighter. It's decently tighter compared to especially to the soft one. Distance control with the soft one got a lot worse. So going after it hard, the distance control got a little bit smaller. It shrunk a little bit. And so, like the takeaway here is if you need to carry something, you need to cover a bunker, you need to cover a hazard, you're probably better off. Again, it's not default rule to everyone all the time. You're probably better off going after that one a little bit harder. That doesn't mean you have to take less clubs. Sometimes it can mean 150 is a good number, but I'm going to really go after this one, hit 155. I know I'm going to be a little bit deep, but my north-south dispersion tightens up, which makes me more likely to cover whatever hazard that is. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway to me. And I was, again, really surprised that the soft shots had as big, quote unquote, dispersion area as it did. I was expecting that because, as you know, you get many amateurs across the lesson tee, and some of us tend to, swing a little bit too hard, and sometimes, going after it a little bit easier is really beneficial for contact, but it also introduces a lot of other, problems for us amateurs that, don't have great phase control, don't have great low point control, and lots of bad things or more bad things can happen in those situations. Next, we're going to talk about.
Sorry, Lou, to interrupt you. One other quick question, just with that graph, since it's still up there. It also looks like the overall, if the 0.0 is, I guess, slightly deeper into the circle, so it's still fair to say most golfers in general still end up a little short of the target, regardless of the scenario or the shots that they select.
Yeah, they do. And the other thing too, I'll say here is this was done, with a launch monitor, and most of the participants in this study, were doing this off of a mat, which is a whole lot more forgiving than doing it off of grass turf. And so if this was done off of a mat, it would, these shapes would change even a little bit more. But yeah, coming up short there's a lot of issues behind that for amateur golfers, but coming up short is clearly for mid and high handicap players, just mostly driven by poor quality of contact. They have bad low point control. They hit it all over the face and they come up short. You hit 3 inches behind it and you hit it, an inch and a half on the heel or the toe, and the ball's not going to go as far as it normally does. And that's one of the driving factors behind, coming up short for players that are, mid and high handicap players. And I'll even say it's still a problem even as you get up to elite players. I've posted stuff and looked at information on PGA Tour players, and I can tell you from, what I do with the Princeton golf team, pretty elite Division I golfers, they stink to front pins. They do really poorly because they're often just getting a number to the pin and kind of playing that number. And even at their level, they don't always hit it on the button. They don't always catch it exactly how they want, and they come up short. And that really magnifies that issue to short pins, right? Because now you've come up a little bit short and you've short-sighted yourself, and maybe there's nothing there and it might be a relatively straightforward up and down, but oftentimes, we're trying to cover bunkers or other things that are in the way, and we certainly end up in way more bunkers to front pins than we do to back pins, just because we don't always hit it on the button. So, good question. Next thing I wanted to cover on this, and you're going to stay right here on this slide, is not necessarily related, but talking about their bag makeup. And let's show the first one here. This was really wild to me when I looked at it. 13% of golfers carry a club that is used less than once every 10 rounds. Like, it's just sitting in there collecting dust. I'm sure you've had plenty of 15 handicaps walk into your lesson tee or into your bay, and they have a 3-iron in the bag, and it hasn't been hit since 2014. And you look at that and you're like, what the heck are you doing with a 3-iron in your bag? Like, you should not be hitting that club. And let's make it even worse. 10%, 1 out of 10 golfers have a club that's used less than once every 20 rounds. So if you have a golfer who plays 100 rounds in a season, which is a lot of golf in 1 year, they're going to use that club less than 5 times over 100 rounds. One of another benefit of a tool like Arccos or a stat tracking tool is not just getting your stats and understanding strengths and weaknesses and where to work on your game and what to focus on, but being able to see things like this, and if you have that club in your bag that doesn't get used, like, get it out of there and replace it with something that is going to have value. And that for a lot of players, because there were a lot of mid and high handicap players that had those 3 and 4 irons in their bag and they just never used them. Like, replace that with a hybrid or a higher lofted fairway wood, which is going to be something that's going to be a lot easier for them to hit and get those in the mix instead of keeping these clubs that never get touched. 3-wood was another big offender for a lot of players. They typically hit driver off the tee and they're scared to death to try to hit 3-wood off the turf, so they never touch it. It just sits there and collects dust. And another thing, and again, this is maybe for a certain kind of player in more advanced situations, I'm definitely of the opinion that you should have more than 14 clubs. That's all you're allowed to take out, but you should have more than 14. And you should be adjusting your bag makeup based on the course you're going to play. And I'm also of the opinion that, sometimes when we think about, yardage gapping, and mapping out your bag to see what your yardage gaps are and keeping that consistent from club to club, I don't always think that's the best approach. Like, we have a couple of players on the Princeton team, and we've looked, and you can see that they have a significant number of approach shots in like that 90 to 140 range. And it's not unusual for better players to have like that, 58, 60 degree wedge that goes 90 yards ish, somewhere in there. And then their next wedge goes like, 115. And then their next wedge goes 140. They have these huge gaps on their wedges, and they're hitting a lot of partial shots in that like 90 to 150 yard range. I'm of the opinion that I might, knowing you can only keep 14 clubs in the bag, try to get smallage yardage gaps in the yardage range that you hit a ton of your approach shots, so that you can hit more stock shots. Because as we see here, your stock shot tends to have a smaller dispersion. So like, if I have 12-yard gaps like through the bag evenly all the way through, that's one way you can do it. But if you play a course or a lot of courses, or for whatever reason you condense a lot of your approach shots in a certain range, I want maybe a little bit tighter gaps in there so that I don't have to have as many in between shots, so I can hit more stock shots. So just a different way to maybe think about bag mapping. Doesn't apply to everyone. We've used this with some more advanced players. And it definitely, there's a lot of benefit there. And hopefully I explain that in a way that makes sense. Now let's head on to the next slide here. Fairways, they are overrated. The scorecard up there, how many of you have filled out a scorecard like this? I know I have. fairways, greens, and number of putts. And traditional stats like this, they can be very, very misleading. So the number of putts and number of fairways hit. If you have players that are doing that and they're showing up and this is the only thing that they're doing, like tell them to get rid of, absolutely get rid of the number of fairways hit and the number of putts. Those are pretty meaningless stats for the most part. And we're going to get here to the fairway numbers here in just a second, but one of the questions I get a lot is there are players out there that, they don't want an Arccos. They don't want to track stats. They don't want an app. They don't want to deal with any of that stuff. They want to, have their little simple few things that they track on their scorecard and they're good with that. And I completely understand that some players are like that and totally fine. But if you're going to do that, like I would want them to track greens and regulation. For as far as traditional stats go, it's really important. There's a very strong relationship between how many greens you hit and what your handicap index is going to be. So track greens and regulation. If you don't want to get into a stat tracking app, track how many penalty strokes you have. Track how many drives you keep in play. So how many tee shots do you keep in play? And in play means like I didn't hit it OB, I didn't hit it in the woods, and I got to come out sideways. Like I have a reasonable chance at knocking the ball on or around the green in regulation. So that's a great one they can track. And then finally, and this really applies more to like the higher handicap players, like keep track of how many horrible shots you have in a round of golf. So those ones where you hit 4 inches behind it and you advance your 120-yard wedge 15 yards, or you top it or you sky it off the tee, something crazy like that. Keep track of the number of horrible shots that you have. So I'd love for people to start getting to the shot level of tracking because there's a ton of value to know that level of detail. But I also appreciate not everybody wants to do that. And if they're not going to do that, kind of steer them in that direction. So they're at least tracking some things that are going to have some really good value to them to allow them to see how they're performing and track that over time so they can see some improvement. So let's talk about fairways being overrated. So I wanted to see how much of a difference fairways made in your best rounds versus your worst rounds. So players needed 40 rounds or more in a calendar year to qualify for the study. So a pretty fair number of rounds. And I looked at their best 20% of their rounds and their worst 20% of their rounds. I wanted to see as a group how they played. So let's pull this up. Let's start with 10 indexes. The dark blue, the darker colored one, in their best round. So that's where they shot their best numbers. They played fantastic that day. It's a 1 out of 5, their best rounds. They averaged 7.1 fairways in their best rounds. And in their worst rounds, they averaged 6.3 fairways. So not a huge difference. And you can see that trend continues kind of across every skill level. Across every skill level, they only average about 3/4 of fairway more in their very best rounds versus their very worst rounds. So where does the problem come in? Well, the problem comes with penalty strokes and recovery situations. So let's stick with our 10 index friends here for a second. You can see that in their very best rounds, they have 1.72 penalty and recovery situations per round. And a penalty situation it means you've hit into a penalty situation. It might be a 1-stroke penalty, it might be a 2-stroke penalty. So 1.72 times they're either hitting into some kind of a penalty or they're hitting it into the trees and they got to come out sideways in their very best rounds. In their very worst rounds, they're doing that nearly 4 times, more than double. So that's where the real benefit is off the tee is just simply keeping it in play. Like you're going to hit about the same number of fairways for the most part. There's certainly going to be some variance, and you're going to hit a little bit less fairways in your worst rounds. But as you can see on the left-hand side, it's not a huge difference. Those are very, very similar numbers. This is where the difference is. They're just not keeping it in play when they're having their bad rounds, and those penalty strokes and the recovery situations are driving up scores. So if you've seen me before talk about why fairways are overrated, like this is one of the driving factors behind that. There's a lot here, but here's what this basically shows you. This shows you the difference in scoring between being in the fairway versus being in the rough from a given distance for a certain handicap. So let's take scratch players, this first column, from 130 to 139 yards. The average shots to get the ball in the hole in the fairway versus being in the rough, it's a tenth of a stroke benefit to being in the fairway versus being in the rough. So these are, not massive differences, and you can see, similar numbers as we look through each different skill level. And, what's interesting, especially when you get out to these 10, 15, 20 index players, when they get a long way from the hole, so, they haven't hit a good tee shot on a par 4 and they got 240 coming in. The difference between being in the fairway or being in the rough, like there's not really a difference for them that far out. And again, like I will say that, that depends on the course. Like if you play a course that has, 4-inch ankle deep, thick rough, then obviously the fairway is where you want to be, and being in the rough is death. But, across typical rough and typical situations, there isn't a huge difference between being in the fairway, being in the rough, as we get farther from the hole. Probably a lot of factors behind that, a lot of 10, 15, 20 indexes, they're not great hitting 3-woods and such off the deck from the fairway. Sometimes, you get in the rough, especially if it's playable, quote unquote, playable rough, the ball's sitting up a little bit higher than it is on a tight fairway, and it might be easier for them to make contact, advance it down there a little bit more. But, again, there's definitely being in the fairway. If I get a choice between being in the fairway and being in the rough, give me the fairway all day long. But that's fairway versus rough is not what's driving scores. It's being in play versus not being in play. That's what's driving scores going up for, across every level. And it becomes even more true for those mid and high handicap players. Next is Texas wedge. Let's talk about putting. So is your worst putt better than your worst chip? When I started playing golf many, many years ago, I might have heard that on the second day I played. We've all probably said it more than once, but is it true? I was really curious if it was true. So look through the Arccos data, and I looked at all skill levels, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. I wanted to look at two distances. So I wanted to look at shots from 12 yards and shots from 20 yards. These are shots that are off the green. And some of these shots were just off the green. So like between 5 and 15 feet off the green. I wanted to be a little bit more than, I didn't want to be just on the fringe 2 inches from the edge of the green. I wanted to be between 5 and 15 feet off the green. And then I wanted to look at the really long ones. The ones where you got a bunch of fairway, and there's a pin on there somewhere, and you can putt through it, you can chip through it. So I wanted to look at the ones that were well off the edge of the green and see how players performed. So let's look at the first one. Putting wins basically in all situations but one, and we'll talk about what that one is. Like putting was definitely better. So when our mid to high handicap friends are, just off the green in that 5 to 15 foot range from the edge of the green, they average a tenth of a stroke better with putter. Their worst putt is between 3 and 6 feet closer than their worst chip. So the old adage, their worst putt tends to be better than the worst chip is definitely true. When our mid to high handicap friends are more than 15 feet from the edge of the green, they're 2/10 of a stroke better with the putter than they are with the wedge from that distance. And one of the things I did was, because Arccos has so many shots, and I would be, if I were you, I'd be thinking about, there might be some situations here where you're just not going to hit putter. It's the green is 10 feet above where you are. You got to putt it up some huge hill. You're not going to do that. I found a number of situations, a number of holes that have, just a massive amount of people that have played those holes. And I looked at how they performed off the green using putter versus using wedge on those holes. So I was just looking at very, very similar situations. Even, in some of the cases, we had enough sample where I could look at kind of a hole on the green, an area on the green, and I could look and see how they performed with putter versus wedge in that very specific situation on this hole to a pin in this kind of location of the green. And all of these things held true in those situations as well. So here, from being a little bit further off the green, that 15 or more feet from the edge of the green, the worst putt again is better than their worst chip by, in that 5 to 7 foot range. Here's the situation. Lower handicap players, they definitely have more options. Lower handicap players, they were able to, once you got up to around, it was like 58, 59 feet, like inside of that, like they should probably putt. But once they get, a little bit outside of that, so almost 20 yards, once they get outside of that, they're just better chipping. And the other thing I'll go back to is what we started off with is everybody's different. And so it's really helpful to know your strengths and weaknesses as a player, even in something like this. So if you are at a course, a club that has a practice green, that has some fairway around it that they could practice the Texas wedge off of, highly encourage that. Like, let them put that into their practice routine to work on that shot, because typically in most situations, they're going to perform a little bit better with their putter than they will with their wedge. But again, we're all different. Play to your strengths, have them spend some time working on putting from off the green and chipping from off the green. Give them some games where they can keep score and see how they do, and let them very clearly see where they're performing better. Like when you do that off the course with them, and they can, you give them a game to play and they can clearly see, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, pro is right. I do better with a putter, putting from off the green in situations, like this, whatever your practice screen shows. And when they find themselves on the course, they're going, instead of guessing, going, oh, should I hit a putter here? Should I hit a wedge here? Now they know, okay, I'm better with the putter here, or I'm better with the wedge here. That's the shot I'm going to play. So it's really helpful to work on this off the course and start to understand what you're good and what you're bad at, so that you can then apply that on the golf course. All right. Last thing I missed there. Make rate, same for putting and chipping. The old myth of, if you want to make it, you should chip it. The make rate for putting and chipping was basically identical. There was no real difference. So at least in all the data that I looked at, even going down to specific situations, specific holes with specific hole locations, like the putting and chipping make rate was the same. There was no real difference. All right, next thing we're going to look at starting slow. And this starting slow was something, again, I stumbled into this. I didn't mean to. And let's just bring this up. Chances of three putting on the first hole is the highest. And the longer the round goes, your chances of three putting continue to kind of go down. The shape of this is you're more likely to three putt on the first hole, and you are least likely to three putt on the last hole. This was true across all skill levels. This is just for 10 index players here. And it was really interesting. I don't know exactly why. I had a few ideas. Maybe golfers just aren't spending enough time warming up speed control before their round. Like, this is something I'd really love to test. I'd love to get some players to participate in going through some type of defined lag putting, speed control before they play a round of golf, to really try to understand this one. But maybe they don't spend enough time warming up on putting. I know at least all my buddies in the course that I play at, most people roll in on two wheels with a coffee and a donut. They maybe hit a few drivers. They maybe hit a couple iron shots. They walk to the first tee, and maybe on the way to the first tee, they drop two balls, hit a few putts, and they're on the first tee. And so I don't see a whole lot of players doing any kind of speed control drills. That could be what's going on. Golfers just, they also tend not to practice putting as much than they do other things. So maybe, like, being out there on the course, they're just starting to kind of get warmed up and just get a groove for putting, because they don't practice it really. And maybe there's just a difference in speed control, or difference in speed. Maybe the practice green's stimping at 9 and the course is stimping at 11, and you show up and you're like, oh, what's going on? This is very different. And that could be part of it. And they're just trying to adjust to the difference in speed from the practice green to the course. But this might be an interesting one to just either observe or talk about with your players, and just maybe give them the nudge that maybe a good speed control session before they start playing would be really beneficial. There also could be maybe some mental components going on, like maybe early in the round, they're just more nervous early in the round. Maybe they're less generous with gimmies early in the round. That could be it too. Like your buddies are not going to give you anything early, and by the time the train wreck is unfolded, they don't really care on the 15th hole, or some combo of the above. But I would definitely talk to your players about some good speed control work before they start playing. Yeah.
Or any I noticed there's a very small spike there on the 12th hole. Any interesting theories why that might be, apart from just statistical noise and sample size?
Yeah, I think it's just noise there.
Okay.
Like, yeah, we really wouldn't worry about that too much. Very, very clearly down here, if I were to put, I'm not going to get into this massive stuff here, but these, this shape is very similar across all skill levels, and I don't have the reason as to why, but I can tell you the shape is pretty similar. And forget the details of this, but it starts higher and it starts to go down lower.
Makes sense.
And again, probably a combination of factors, and it's probably different for different people. But I do know one thing, for at least anecdotally from what I see, and I'm guessing a lot of you would shake your head yes, I don't see a ton of players spending time doing speed control drills before they step on the first tee. And I think that would change what this looks like if players spend some time there. Anything else, sir? Good. All right.
That was great. Thank you.
Yep. Next, we're going to talk about chasing angles. This will be the last thing that we look at, and then we'll get into a bunch of questions. I wanted to look at shots from the fairway. And I wanted to understand, does the angle matter? This is one of the very first things I looked at when I started doing golf analytics years ago now. I looked at it for PGA Tour players. And then after I got access to the Arccos data, I wanted to see what it looked like for amateur players. Like, what does this look like? Does the angle matter for amateur players? Like, if the hole's on the right, do you try to go up the left, and vice versa? Is that going to make it easier for you to score? And so what I looked at second shots on par fours. And I only wanted holes where the fairway was at least 30 yards wide. And the pin was cut at least 6 yards or less from the edge of the green. So I wanted kind of wider fairways, at least 30 yards. And I wanted holes where they were close to the edge. And then I wanted to look at, the extreme sides of the fairway. So what I would call a side of the fairway was, it had to be in the left or right 20% of the fairway. So if a fairway is 30 yards wide, they had to be in the left 6 yards of the fairway or the right 6 yards of the fairway to be considered on the left or the right side of the fairway. Wanted to make sure they had the best angle from that side. And the center of the fairway was the middle 25% of the fairway. So on a 30-yard wide fairway, they would have to be, about 4 yards, a little bit less than 4 yards in either direction from the center point of the fairway. And I looked across all skill levels. I'm going to show some 5 index players here. I looked across all skill levels. When I pull this up, there's a lot here to look at. Don't get lost in the numbers. I'll just briefly walk you through what you're looking at here. So this is when the hole is on the left. The very middle one here, center of the fairway. This shows the scoring average for 5 index players when they're in the center of the fairway, when the hole is on the left from these distances. All right. And the cells that are highlighted in green here in the middle, left fairway, center fairway, right fairway, this shows you where the lowest scoring average is. So if you just look at this middle chunk right here, you can see the center fairway is all green. And then the left side of the fairway from 175 had the lowest score out of the 3 scores from the fairway. And this side is the bad angle. Remember, our hole is on the left. Being on the left side of the fairway and the hole's on the left is the bad angle. Being on the right side is the good angle. There wasn't one situation here where the lowest score was on the right side of the fairway to holes on the left. And then the right rough and the left rough. So green here from 100 yards shows that the left rough, 3.35, is lower than the right rough, 3.37. So the bad angle was the better angle in two of the distances, and the right rough was in one of the distances, and they tied for one of them. Let's look at this from holes on the right. Same concept. These are our shots from the fairway. You can see it's all green down the middle. Center of the fairway had the lowest overall, or had the best scoring average. Not huge differences between these, but best scoring average. Right had the best scoring average in 2 out of the 5, and this is the bad angle. And the good angle was best in 3 out of the 5 distances. So a lot to, let's go to the overall results here. So center of the fairway was the lowest score 78% of the time. 70 across all those situations just showed 78% of the time. And by the way, this holds across all skill levels. I forgot if I mentioned that. So we were looking at 5 index players. This is like this for everybody from scratch to 20 index players. The bad fairway angle was the lowest score 18% of the time. The good fairway angle was the lowest score only 5% of the time. If you only compare the good side of the fairway to the bad side of the fairway was lowest score 59% of the time. If you only compare the good side of the rough to the bad side of the rough was lowest score 66% of the time. And it's not to say you need to, I don't want you to try to be in a certain side of the fairway. I don't want you to try to be in certain, rough on purpose. We want to be in the fairway as much as we possibly can. And, trying to go up a side of the fairway is not a good idea. It just brings more trouble into play. Remember, being in the fairway, you're typically going to score lower than being in the rough. The only time you should really aim away, aim to a side of the fairway or even aim into the rough is when you're trying to avoid trouble. Like you got a big lake up the left side, like aim way over to the right. You got OB, aim way away from that stuff. Keep the ball in play because that's what driving scores. So, is the better angle sometimes better? It is. Yeah, it definitely is. Like, again, not every situation is the same. Should you intentionally play for the better angle? No, you shouldn't, because again, you're going to bring more trouble into play. So, why is this going on? Why are we typically scoring the best from the middle of the fairway and, not scoring the best from the good side, the good angle? I think what is going on here is based on the myth that we've always heard, right? It's not only should you chase the angle, like if the pin's on the right, go up the left side. There's the second part of that where when you have the good angle, you should be more aggressive because you have the good angle. And what ends up happening when you look at the data is when you have the good angle, players do tend to get more aggressive and they short side it more. And short siding it more often is not a recipe for good scores. You don't want to short side it that much. You don't want to never short side it, but you don't want to short side it a lot. And players get way too aggressive when they have the good angle. When they have the bad angle, they maybe get a little bit too conservative. But when they're in the middle of the fairway, they've kind of defaulted and backed their way into a more optimal target where they don't have the great angle, so they're not being too aggressive. They don't have the quote unquote bad angle, so they're not being too conservative and aiming far away from the flag. Like they found that they've backed into a sweet spot of optimal target in the middle of the fairway. And I think that's kind of what we see in the data is that's what's going on. So again, last thing, and I think this bears repeating again, is it's fine to aim up a side of the fairway or even into the rough when you're avoiding trouble. Like do it to avoid trouble. Do it to reduce penalty shots, reduce the chances of hitting it into the woods where you got to come out sideways. But don't do it because, the pin's on the right and you want to be on the left for a better angle, because you're just going to be in the rough more often and you're going to score higher from the rough than you are from the bad angle in the fairway. So in those situations, try to hit as many fairways as you can and don't chase it up the side. All right, and that kind of gets through. I went 1 minute over my hour, but I'm happy to stick around, and we can turn the slide deck off now if you want. I'll turn the stop share off. I don't think we have anything else to show, and we can just go through some Q&A. Mark, I'll turn it over to you. Mark, feel free to lead us through.
Yeah, well, thank you, Luke. Right off the bat, we'll get to proper thanks here at the end of Q&A. But right at the end, we had a couple of members that asked the exact question you kind of there answered. Yeah, could it be kind of an aggression change from those situations that kind of balances the numbers, so to speak? So that's kind of very interesting there.
Yep.
So we've got a number of questions, so I'll kind of start to throw them at you, and please feel free to dive into as much detail as each.
Sounds good.
One of the first questions we got sent in was comparing. I know some of your content in the past has focused on how dominant Tiger was, especially kind of in a heyday type period. Common question we get nowadays is how close is Scottie Scheffler's current form? Take that to mean whatever you mean exactly to Tiger's kind of around 2000 legendary run. And then the sub question there is there anything, is there a sub consideration of field strength? Are the field a lot stronger nowadays compared to even 25 years ago? And does that play into that conversation at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a very complex and nuanced question to answer. One thing I'll say, I'll give a shout out to your Canadian brothers, datagolf.com. Like if you're familiar with them, they do a really good job at looking at, they have their own kind of adjusted formula they call true strokes gained. And they do a really good job at showing how players are performing against the field. You can go back and they do a lot of stuff historically. First, let's talk, like Scheffler's on a pretty unbelievable run. I don't have it in front of me, but I want to say he's 3.2-ish, 3.3 strokes better than the field right now last year, somewhere around there, which, since Tiger's historic runs, like nobody's been close to that. So he's playing some unbelievable golf. Is field strength a consideration? It is, and Data Golf, makes some adjustments based on field strength. And I'm of the strong opinion that fields continue to get stronger and will continue to get stronger, every year, every decade. And so, the fields that Tiger played in were stronger than the fields that Jack played in, and the fields that Jack played in were stronger than the fields that Old Tom played in. And right now, with a little bit of a caveat, like nuanced, like are the players today better than they were 25 years ago? Yes, absolutely. We got a little bit of a curveball there with how disjointed professional golf is, and there are definitely some really good world-class players that went to live, the Brysons of the world and Joaquin Niemann and Terrell and all that, who are not playing a full slate of PGA Tour events. So while the overall typical average tour player is a lot better today than they were 25 years ago. They're not all in the same place at one time. And I'm not trying to say that to diminish what Scotty's doing, because he's playing unbelievable golf right now. But there's a little bit of that in the mix here. I don't know exactly how much.
Two different forces at play for the field size. Like you say,
for
you
sure.
got the evolution, but then you've got a segmentation as well. Yeah.
Definitely. But fields will continue to get stronger. 50 years from now, fields are going to be significantly stronger than they are today, and they were in Tiger's peak in his prime. So that's just how it works. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Money is a huge driving factor. You go back, and I've posted some stuff about this, like back in the early 80s, you can look at what they played for on the PGA Tour. And, if you finished, don't hold me to this, I don't have it in front of me, but like 100th on the money list on the PGA Tour in the early 80s, you were basically making what the annual household income was back then. And that's before your expenses. And now that's for 125th. So it was 125th on the money list. And now if you finish 125th on the money list, you're making like 17, 18 times, 19 times annual household income. So it's not just that there's more money. Like when you think of it in context of, imagine being the 100th best player on the PGA Tour in 1981 and making the same amount before your expenses as like the house next door where, they were a middle school math teacher, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what the situation was, which not a lot less players were drawn to golf back then because the money was nowhere near as deep as it is now. I remember I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and there was a gentleman who was a member there who was, a Walker Cupper named Ward Wetlaufer. Walker Cupper, like one of the top two, top three collegiate players, was really good friends with Jack Nicklaus. They were in each other's weddings. And I asked him one time, I caddied for him a bunch, and I asked him one time why he never went pro. Because imagine a top two, top three player in college right now, not going professional or not even trying to go professional. It's just unheard of. And that's what he was. He was like, he was a Mason Howell. He was a, pick your top player. He was a Jackson Koivung. And he's like, no, I'm not going to go pro. When I asked him why, he was like, there's just no real money in it. Like you could make some money if you were a top 5 player, top 10 player, but there was no real money in it. Like if you were a 70th, 80th place player, you're kind of scraping by and making no money. So that's changed significantly, and that just draws more people. And then we just get smarter about everything. We're smarter about fitness. We're smarter about nutrition. We're strategy, the swing, everything just continues to improve and get better.
Well, you brought up Live Golf. That was one of the questions I actually had, was about tracking performance trends for players who have moved over there. I know we would have some major appearances and things like that, but overall, kind of a relatively small sample size. But was curious if there's any kind of general perception on whether that has. I mean, we've seen guys like Bryson have success in playing the tournaments afterwards, but we've seen some other players apparently take a step backwards. I wondered if there was any kind of quantification to that, that move, so to speak.
It's not something I spent a lot of time on. I don't know that I'd be able to answer that one directly. Again, Data Golf does a really good job at looking at performance of these players. They gauge everyone based on their true strokes gained against sort of the typical field. And you can go on there right now to, Data Golf rankings, and you can see where the live players stack up. And there's some that are way up near the top, and there's some that are, nowhere near the top. And you can see how they're performing right now. And those numbers at Data Golf are really good. They're, I think they do an amazing job at giving you, an estimation of performance and how they're playing. And there's some live players that are way up there and some that are not way up there.
Sure. I mean, obviously, you've got an affiliation with Arccos Golf. Many of our members are definitely familiar with the company and its products. But there's a lot of apps and websites out there, so that's one question we've had from a number of different professionals. Out of all the different options that they have, do you have any kind of recommended starting points, either for themselves or for student-facing options as well, maybe over and above, let's say, Arccos?
Well, definitely, I would say, I'm part of Arccos. I think it's a fantastic product. I've been with them for 4 years, and they continue. There's some things in the pipeline, that are continuing to come out that are really, really cool. And I know they're really cool because I get to, the Princeton team gets to be the guinea pig, and I get to see and be part of the bleeding edge of what's coming, and I'm getting to use that now, and there's some amazing things coming. So I'd love for people to use Arccos, but I'm a data nerd, I'm a data junkie. Like if you don't want to use an app at all and you want to put it on the back of the napkin and write it all down by hand, cool, do that. Whatever works for you to start tracking your stats. I'd love for you to use Arccos, but if that doesn't work for you and you want to do something else, there's some other there's other options out there for you. You need to do something. Your players need to do something. They have to start tracking their information so they know where they're performing well, where they're not performing well. That's not only going to help them, it's going to help you. And it's going to give you guidance on what's working, what's not working, where they need to spend more time with you, where they need to spend more time in practice. It's going to identify opportunities in strategy, shot selection, club selection. It's going to help you do all that stuff. So pick something that's going to give you shot level data. And then I also fully understand that not everyone is as much of a math nerd as I am, and they're like, nope, I'm out. I can't do any of that stuff. Go back to, remember our scorecard from earlier in the presentation. Go back to that and get them to track a couple of simple things. If they're going to do if they don't only want to track one thing, tell them to track greens and regulation. Just start there. That's a great one to do. There's another one that's, similar to greens and regulation. It's called like greens and regulation plus one. And it originally was in Mark Brody's book, Every Shot Counts. And that's really helpful for like a 20 handicap player. 20 handicap doesn't hit many greens. So you tell them to track greens in regulation and they're like, all right, like I hit 2. All right. Yeah, because that's about what they're going to hit. All right. I hit 1 today. Like that's kind of demoralizing to a 20 handicap player. So have them track how many times they're putting for par. So green in regulation plus 1 shot. So if it's a par 4, they're on in 3 shots. Like they have a putt for par. Have them start tracking that because there's a strong relationship there. It's not as strong as greens in regulation, but there's very strong relationship there to how many greens in regulation plus 1 they hit and what their index is going to be. And that's a good one for higher handicap players to track because it doesn't feel great to write down 0, 1, 1, 1, 2. Oh, I hit 3 greens today. Amazing day. Like you want them writing down 6, 7, 8, things like that, which is what will happen when they start, tracking greens and reg plus 1. And then have them track penalty shots, like horrible shots, drives in play. Those things that we talked about are fantastic if you don't want to get into tracking shot level. But I would encourage you to encourage your players to get into tracking shot level because there's so much value there.
Yeah, excellent. Greens and reg plus 1, probably a very good tool for a lot of our players to use.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
Had some questions about your thoughts on the PGA Tour product. How could the broadcast better improve from incorporating analytics on a more consistent basis? You still get a lot of lame old stats, which you even kind of touched on yourself. And so when it does come up in a segment, because once in a while we do see them, it seems generally additive if done properly. Also feels like a big gateway into the general population, better understanding some of these misconceptions and the stuff in their own game. Any thoughts on your end from maybe opportunities that broadcasters would have?
Yeah, I mean, if it were up to me, like I'd be pausing the broadcast, we'd go on a whiteboard and we'd spend 10 minutes walking through at the detailed level, but you need a lot of people tuning out if you do that. I definitely think they've made advances there. And I know that, Arccos, one of the investors of Arccos is the PGA Tour. And so there have been PGA Tour broadcasts where they've incorporated amateur stats to kind of show you, here's a situation that, Scotty's in, and here's what an amateur here's what a 10 index, a 15 index, a 20 index would do in this situation. And when they've done some of those, I think those are really valuable. I think they give context. But that's a balancing act for them too, right? Like I'm not going to pretend that everyone is going to want to dive into detailed level stats. There's a lot of players there's a lot of really good players, low index players, plus index players, college players. If you ask them to explain strokes gained and what it is and what it means and how it works, they have no clue. And so, for the general population to expect them to get into some more of the advanced stuff, that's a tough job. Like, I don't know. That's something you'd have to do a lot of trial and error on and try a couple of different things, small things, and see what direction it goes to see how the audience reacts because, they don't have the luxury of, putting out a blog post and seeing if it gets a lot of reads or a lot of clicks. Like, they get a short window and their ratings have to be really good. And if they start doing things where people tune out, like I appreciate the situation that they're in. I'd love to see a lot more. I think they've done some cool things. And I think they could definitely do some more things, but like that, not everybody's like me. And there's a lot of people are going, no, take the numbers down. I don't want to see them.
Coming from someone who might want to see the numbers up, Jared, I think you've got your hand raised.
I do. Lou, thank you very much for the time. This has been fantastic. As a coach, I'm sure everybody on this call has had an average golfer standing in front of them for that initial lesson where they're explaining, how they feel about each aspect of their game, and they tend to be terrible at that. That's not
Horrible.
necessarily something that anybody is good at. Stats it's really easy to be antagonistic when you're kind of showing somebody the numbers and just saying this is correct. I'm sure you've had that conversation, time after time, especially with some higher level players. How do you kind of handle that? When you're basically telling somebody their evaluation of themselves is way off.
Yeah, it's another I think huge benefit of tracking your stats because it removes your bias, and we all have bias. And Every Shot Counts by Mark Brody. Mark Brody is the one who invented strokes gained. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that. If you haven't read Every Shot Counts, you need to. If you aren't recommending it to your students, you need to. It's a really, really valuable resource for people to go through, and it helps them start to think about the game, in a different aspect. At the beginning of that book, there's a story by Sean Foley, Sean Foley's Canadian, isn't he? Is that right? Yeah, he's Canadian. Yeah. So there's a story by Sean with Justin Rose, and about how Rose thought his wedge game was really poor. And Foley's like, dude, what are you talking about? You're like second or third on the tour and strokes gained with your wedges. What do you you're one of the best wedge players. You're top 3 wedge player in the world. And he had this image in his mind of his own wedge game, and it was so far from reality. Like you may have noticed, he's pretty good at golf. Like he's a really solid player. And he had no idea that he thought his wedge game stunk, and it was one of the best in the world. The podcast I do, Greg Chalmers is one of the co-hosts, and Greg, who's now in the Champions Tour, 25-year career on the PGA Tour, close to creeping up on 500 starts. One win, but like a journeyman, a lot of time out there. And statistically, in the ShotLink era, he's like a top 3, top 4 putter. In the ShotLink era, which makes him, one of the best putters in the history of the game. And he told a story on the podcast on how he went to his coach and he told his coach, like, putting is holding me back. Like, we got to focus on putting. I don't know what the heck's going on. And his coach is like, Greg, you're second on the PGA Tour in strokes gained putting right now. What are you talking about? And we dove a little bit deeper into it. And I don't remember if that part was on the recording or if we talked about it after we turned the microphones off. But he was like, I think what happened was, like, I maybe missed an 8-footer to like make a cut or something. You just missed a putt, like one putt at an inopportune time. And that just sort of got into his head. And then what happened was, every time he missed a putt from that distance or around that distance or a shorter one, which is going to happen, he just went, yeah, I stink at putting. And he was forgetting all the ones he was making. And he was making them at a very high rate because he was second on the PGA Tour in strokes gained putting. And all he remembered was the bad stuff. And it's tracking your stats helps to remove that bias that we sometimes are all guilty of at every skill level, from Justin Rose and Greg Chalmers to, Mr. Haverkamp, 25 handicap. And we're all guilty in between. And the other thing too, that I think it does is, if you have a typical player and they're like, I stink at my wedges, like Justin Rose example. And their thought is always, I stink at my wedges. And when they hit a bad wedge shot, which they're going to, or a mediocre wedge shot, which they're going to, they reinforce that belief, which then could start tipping them towards performing worse with their wedges because the way they're thinking about it, the way they're performing. And that will then make them a worse wedge player than they are because they just don't understand the black and white of how they're actually performing. They have the wrong thing in their mind. And I think that works the other way too, right? I think sometimes people put their head in their sand. Oh yeah, Bob, he's never missed a putt. He makes every 4-footer in the world. And Bob walks around the club like he's the best short putter that's ever played golf. And he's not even close. But they just kind of feed the myth by every 4-footer Bob makes and goes, like, see, Bob. And when Bob misses them, they go, well, he usually makes those. Well, no, he doesn't always usually make those. So tracking your stats and knowing that, like, removes that from happening. And I've had some very, beneficial conversations with Princeton players and some other, high-level players around this very particular topic. And most of them are very open to wanting to understand. They want the truth because they're trying to play better. And whether that's a tour player or whether that's a Division I college player, whether that's a 20 handicap on the weekend, we all want to try to play better. And removing the guesswork, removing the confirmation bias gives us really good information on how we're actually performing so that we can focus work in the right place, and not get hung up on things that might not be a problem. So great question, really good question.
A couple interesting examples there of let's say a big discrepancy between perception and reality from a couple of tour pros. Is there a category where let's say your average 10 handicap, 515, if there's one you're familiar with, where that's the biggest discrepancy there? Is it like we're saying maybe with something as simple as kind of short putts, or is there a very commonly held, I guess, difference or discrepancy between people's perception and their reality?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a ton of data on perceptions. I've done some work with, on the perception side with Arccos data on how far players hit their driver. One of the things when you onboard with Arccos, it kind of asks you how far you hit your driver, and it was fascinating to see like what people say, and what the reality is. And so, that's just one example of, I think a lot of amateur golfers, and I have the data to show this, they think they hit the ball a lot farther than they actually do. I think wedges are another area too, where players, they think they are a lot worse at those full wedges in that 100-yard range than they actually are, because their expectations are, maybe a little bit out of whack of what is reality for their skill level. And I think those are some, putting, I think every part of the game, and you're going to find players that fit every mold. You're going to have some players that, are the Sean Foley, Justin Rose, and the Greg Chalmers example. You're going to find that at every skill level, about every part of the game, in both directions. And that's why, having that shot level detail removes those opinions that are often wrong, and really can help you manage your expectations when you start thinking about that. And managing your expectation doesn't mean like I want you to, every time you step up to the shot, I want you to try, pick a good target and do everything you possibly can to hit the ball exactly where you're looking, exactly where you want it to go. You're not going to every time, but it doesn't mean you're not going to try every time. Managing your expectations doesn't mean you've thrown up your hands and you've thrown in the towel and you don't care what happens. It just means you're not going to beat yourself up when you hit a shot that is within the realm of possibility for your skill level. I think that is a very positive way to play the game.
On a similar kind of line, you gave some examples earlier about having conversations with, let's say, your Princeton players on course about, when, let's say, the mathematically optimal shot and whether that gives them the heebie-jeebies or not. And so I was kind of wondering how often that comes up or that happens. Because I feel like nowadays, especially maybe at Princeton, especially being advised by someone like yourself, a lot of players would get it in that, no, if I'm 50 yards, I'm going to hit it closer, even if I don't like it as much as if I'm stock 100 or whatever. But how often do you get some pushback on that where they go, no, I'm going to default to my comfort? Sorry.
I get that a lot more than you would think. I get that a pretty fair amount where players just get, for whatever reason, they get into situations where there's a lot of variance day to day with golf. Some days you are hitting your windows and you're flighting it exactly how you want. And some days you're like, I don't know what the heck's going to happen next, even at high levels. And I don't know what's going to happen next for, the best player on the Princeton team is very different than when a 15 handicap says that. So I'm not going to pretend it's the same. But, depending on how they are doing, how they are feeling, how a shot sets up for them, how the ball is sitting. The ball might be a little bit below their feet. The wind might be off their back. Like that's a situation that they're just like, I don't like this. And I don't want to, I want to minimize my I want to minimize my variance in this situation, so I'm going to be a little bit more conservative. And it's a balancing act as a coach when I'm out there with a player walking around a golf. It's a balancing act on, typically they're the boss. They're hitting. I'm not hitting any shot. They're hitting the shot. So whatever they want to do is what we're going to end up doing. I try to give them the options and say, this is mathematically might be your best option, but like if you're not comfortable, that's not the best option anymore. Like let's figure out what the best option is given the situation. And that's the part where you're kind of balancing your way through that. But I'm a big proponent of trying to navigate those adjustments, because if you're just playing the same thing every single time, like that is, everyone on this call golfs, that you have some days where the ball's going where you're looking, and you have some days where you're like, I don't know what's going on right now. You can't play those 2 days the same. You got to adjust within those days. And even when you're having a great day, you get a situation you don't really like. I want to get you comfortable in a situation, and we identify those opportunities and we work to try to get you more comfortable with the math. But at the same time, you have to hit the shot. And if you are not confident and accepting of outcomes, standing over a shot, like we probably shouldn't hit that shot, and we should try something different.
The idea being, if the confidence isn't high enough, you're probably not even going to execute the shot that's expected to the same point, and there you go. Then it tips the other way maybe a little bit.
Yeah. If you try to hit something and you got the heebie-jeebies, like your dispersion is going to get bigger, and when your dispersion gets bigger, your scores are going to go up, and you have to get more conservative with targets. So, it's a balancing act to figure out, but you'd be surprised at the pushback that I get. Not every player is the same. There are some players that are a little bit easier than others, but I definitely get a fair amount of pushback. And I don't know if it helps or it hurts, but the Princeton kids, they're really smart. And so you can't fool them with anything. They are off the charts brilliant. And so you can't trick them like you can. I'm not going to pick on any other schools, but they're smart kids.
A couple of questions kind of circulating around course management, kind of strategy and kind of playing around there. Everything from whether another system, Decade, a system that's kind of popular out there, and also whether you have any kind of recommended procedures for assessing or for overlaying one's strengths and weaknesses into kind of a strategy. Like, is there in terms of picking targets, I guess, off the tee and things like that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack on that one. There's a ton there. Let's start off with like strengths and weaknesses, and knowing parts of your game that you're good and bad at. Like we have a couple players on the Princeton team that are unbelievable drivers of the golf ball. Like you put a driver in their hand, it's a weapon, and it is their strength, and we want to hit driver as much as possible. And we have a couple of players on the team where they need some work with their driver. And while driver typically mathematically is the play, for them in certain situations it isn't always the play, because they're gonna risk OB penalties, recovery shots, and they're gonna risk it at a high enough percentage where it becomes baggage, and they score worse when they do that. So, understanding what part of your game is really strong and really weak, can help you make some of those decisions. But I think more importantly, you want to take that information and you want to use that to help make that weakness not a weakness anymore. Give you the ability to work on those things so that players on Princeton that are struggling with driver, like they're working with their coach to make that not a struggle, trying to make that better. Players that are struggling with wedges, distance control and wedges, which is a big thing. We've identified those kind of issues, and they're working at those issues to make them better. Like I can see with with some of the advanced stuff we do with Princeton, I can see how they performed if, holes on the left or on the right. Our best player on the Princeton team, he's really good. I don't know, he's 140th in Wagger. And he made a couple of really small swing tweaks. Again, he's really good. He's, in the top 150 amateurs in the world. And his ball flight changed just a little bit. So his ball flight, he always used to hit cuts. And now he hits these little baby draws, which I hate him for, but he hits these little tiny baby draws. And what's interesting is in the fall season, he was really, really bad to pins on the right, super bad to pins on the right. And when we looked at it, it was a pins on the right versus pins on the left. The difference was remarkable at how bad he was to those pins on the right. And that's what he's working through, and what we're trying to work through and get him more comfortable with is now that he's hitting these little draws, he's really uncomfortable with starting the ball way further right than he ever did, because he was always hitting, I don't want to little cuts, little to medium cuts. He was always hitting those, and now he's hitting this little draw. The ball's going the other way, and he just can't get comfortable. You just can't get comfortable putting it out there too far to the right. And so what he does is his target is way, way, way too far to the left. And then he's, getting the heebie-jeebies even more, and he's tugging him way left with what's going on. And, working through that with him and, identifying that weakness has allowed him to, the back half of the season and some of the events he's played in now has allowed him to make those adjustments and understand what's going on and pick better targets. He can see that he's looking at the data. He now trusts that draw a whole lot more. And so he's making strides there. So I don't know, if there's anything I missed in that question, feel free to repeat it, but there was so much there. I feel like we could talk about that one question for another 2 hours.
And so I know it's already evening where you are, so
I'm good. Again, I can keep talking. So if there's questions, let's keep going.
Well, one of actually the last questions that I have, but I will encourage all of our attendees still to type more questions into the chat. Still staying on kind of course design and setup. We've seen kind of bomb and gouge be kind of around and prevalent for kind of a while now, but we also don't seem to see a ton of golf course setups that seem to push back against it a whole lot, i.e. the old school US Open setups of real narrow fairways and real long rough. So just kind of wondering if you have any I guess, evaluations on, or have we just kind of more adopted that is kind of the high level play style? Is there maybe more pushback for some golf courses that aren't appreciated yet? Or what are your thoughts on kind of that?
Yeah, I think that's, again, we could talk about this one for a long time. This is a very passionate topic of mine. But that's kind of a loaded question. And what I mean by that is you previewed that one for me. I knew that one was coming. And if you follow me on Twitter, you saw what I posted a couple hours ago, because I went out and grabbed a couple of things this afternoon in between, taking care of my very sick daughter. I'm going to read a couple of things right now. So just hit the ball as hard as you can toward the green and flip it up there with a wedge. That's every pro's pattern. Actually, the pros have degenerated into a clique of slug and flip artists. That was in the February 1955 Golf Digest. The character of the game has been somewhat affected by the modern appliances that have followed. The bunkers of our forefathers are no longer a matter of concern to us. USGA President R.H. Robertson wrote that in 1902. Professional golf has become a game of brute power. At Oakmont in the U.S. Open, Nicklaus sailed his tee shots over newly placed bunkers, which were supposed to bother the modern power hitters. Golf Digest, 1962. Last one, Sports Illustrated, 1967. With his power and ability to carry the ball in the air a long way, Nicklaus often drives over bunkers that catch shorter offline tee shots. This means he doesn't have to worry as much about the sand, nor does he have to worry about being in the rough. It doesn't bother him as much as it does other golfers, even Palmer, for he's able to take advantage of his strength there too as he slams the club through the heavy grass. In short, in the IBM events, which include most of the big tournaments of the year, Nicklaus did not drive well, but paid a limited penalty for his tee shot errors. Like, so, and these are only 4 examples. I've posted probably 400 examples like this. Like, you can go back through like American Golfer. There's a couple of online digital archives, and yeah, I'm a nerd. And like at night, I've read through a bunch of these old articles, and they've been complaining about distance in golf since golf started. So, bomb and gouge, if that's even a term, and I don't even quite know what that means. Like, they used to call it slug and flip in 1955. Like, that's 70 years ago. They were talking about the same exact thing. So, and I'm not exactly answering the question around, course design and setup. I really like holes where I have multiple options and the options are about the same, right? So I can hit driver or I can hit 3-wood and my expected score is exactly the same. Those are my favorite kind of holes because then I truly have the option on how I'm going to play it. Like when I step up on most holes, whether I'm looking at it for me or looking at it for a Princeton player or anyone else, the decisions are usually they're usually pretty obvious. Like it's yep, hit driver, try to keep it in play, and knock it on the green, and make no worse than par. So the decisions are usually pretty obvious. I love the holes where I have options, not just options. You always have an option. You can hit a 7-iron off every tee if you want, but I love the ones where the options result in the same expected score because then it starts to, okay, well, what's the strength of the golfer, and maybe that changes based on conditions and wind and what you missed a 2-footer on the last hole and it's going to change how you're feeling. And I love those kind of holes. And I think I'm not a huge architect nerd, but I appreciate architecture. And I think there's a lot of great courses out there and a lot of great holes that are fun and interesting to play. And that's one of the things I enjoy the most about working with the Princeton team is, prepping for events, and in trying to optimize our decisions as much as we possibly can. And sometimes architecture presents situations that are a little bit more fun than others. And I think that's one of the great things about golf is it's, every basketball court, every football field, every hockey rink, pretty much the same dimensions. It's the same thing. For golf, it's all different and lots of stuff going on.
Interesting. I had one question from one of our golf instructor professionals, Brady Stead, out at Ledgeview. When you see a Princeton player struggle with an aspect of the game, for example, data shows too many recovery shots after driving, what has worked well for you when navigating the conversation with their technique coach or swing mechanic coach?
Yeah, college golf is interesting in that, and I'm sure lots of there are lots of coaches on this call, have worked with, will work with college players. They all pretty much have their own swing coach. I'm not a swing coach. I'm the last person you want me to, coach your swing. They all have their own coach, and some coaches are a whole lot more involved, and want to talk to you about the game, about the data. There's a few players on the team where I have, regular calls with their coach, and I'm, often helping them interpret some of the nuance of the data. They're not as quite as deep into it as I am, so I'm walking them through some of the things I'm seeing and what I think they mean based on, my time out there with the player, my time, on the practice range or on the golf course with the player. So there's definitely some coaches where you're working very directly with. There's other coaches where you don't really work with them at all, and you're kind of working with them through the player. But no surprise when it comes to elite athletes, elite Division I players. They're all there to play as well as they possibly can, and they all want to get a lot better. And so they're all very driven, right? They didn't become as good as they are at golf by not being driven and committed and into it all. So it's very easy to work with players at that level because, they want to be as good as they possibly can. Not that every golfer doesn't want to improve, but I'm sure many of you have given lessons and to 15, 20 index players and given them homework, and I haven't done any of it. Where, these elite players, like when you develop those relationships with them, and they have that trust in you and in their swing coaches. Like, you give them something to do and they're going to do it. And so it's easier, I think, to work with elite players than it is to work with a 15 handicap with, a job, 3 kids, all sorts of stuff going on. So it's easy to work with these elite players because they're just so driven.
Yeah, priorities definitely come into play, and availability.
Absolutely, 100%.
We've got an interesting question here from Bryn Perry, actually our teacher of the year last year, but also recently inducted into the BC Golf Hall of Fame for his playing. Congrats again, Bryn.
Yeah, congrats.
So Bryn's wondering if there's any data on how quickly a player will improve if, let's say, two different control groups here. One starts very short distance and moves back after their score is improved, versus someone who maybe is learning to play from the blacks or the tips and works to lower their score that way. Are there any kind of comparables or studies that you're aware of?
I'm guessing like I'm sure you guys know Operation 36 guys. They were at the national conference in Canada a couple of years ago, and you got to chat with them. And I'm sure they have some really good data on that. I think the program that they've put together and how they attack that for newer golfers, whether that be a 5-year-old kid or a 50-year-old adult that's never played golf before, I think that their approach and how they look at that, I think is really sound. I think there's a lot to, how they attack that with, starting, from really short distances and then getting longer and longer and longer. I think there's a lot of benefit to that. And not to say that you don't want your players, never picking up driver until, after being in the game for a while. I think you do. But I think the on-course way they approach it, I think, is fantastic, and I absolutely love that. I wish I had good data on that question to answer that. I'm sure have the Operation 36 guys on. I'm sure they have some really good info. Like, not be able to fully answer that question, but I bet they have some really good info on that bit with what they do and how many golfers they've touched over the years.
Excellent. Well, Luke, thank you again so much. Super appreciate your time. Again, we're kind of diving well into your evening there.
Well, we're not done yet, Mark. This is the part of the program where we all get to work on my swing. So we got about 2 hours ahead of us here.
You can throw some video up. We get to
no, I'm not putting video. No, we're not. I'm not that can't get out into the public. I'll be finished if it does.
Well, I mean, hopefully at some point you're able to make your way physically up here to the Greater Vancouver area, Lower Mainland. We got a whole bunch of pros that would love to have a crack at it if you are interested in that.
I got to see my buddy Jason Giesbrecht. I don't know if he joined us today, but Jason's my buddy.
He did.
Yeah.
We've got quite a few people still in the meeting, even this deep in. But Lou, again, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. Extra long Q&A, especially when you've got a sick family in tow. Please take care of them there. But on behalf of all the pros in attendance here, we really do appreciate you helping us. So thank you very much.